Okay, now I think we're ready to start to put this together as a strategy, as a plan, because in its essence, that's what composition truly is. So let's look at our whole strategy, or a strategy as I see it at the moment. Because one of the interesting things about looking at everyone's work is how many parts of what I do when I compose have become conscious that were actually unconscious for me until I started working with you. So thank you very much. It looks like a lot of verbiage, but we're going to go through it one by one. Right. First of all, even though every frame is in essence the final subject, that's not your objective, and that's probably not the gist of your idea. So the very first thing is, what is your objective? What is the gist? And then what are your constraints? I mean, what are the number of elements? What is the hierarchy of significance? Do you have limitations on funding, of materials? And then you look and you need to decide and then measure your frame. And particularly if your frame is given to you, you need to be really careful about measuring it. And then what I do is I make a first initial guess. Just my basic idea, get it out. Just get some mud on the wall. That's really important place to start. And then I decompose my frame, but I decompose it using my initial idea, my initial guess, and this is usually the hardest part, figuring out how, from what my design idea is, how I would actually decompose this frame. It takes practice and a certain amount of trial and error. And I usually find myself saying, wow, that would be good for a margin, or oh, that's a beautiful shape. And then you start using that again because you overlay them over your initial design. And this is where you really start to check yourself and see what's going on. This is where you take those negative shapes and you make them conscious instead of unconscious as much as you can, because you got to remember, some of this probably isn't ever going to be completely conscious. Our visual system is just so complex. Of course, now we get to the really fun part, because now you get to modify and look at things and try to see where every kind of self-similarity that makes sense, that excites you, and this is where I have the most fun. Now you need to remove all the guides and everything you have there, because these are elements, and sometimes a design will look really nice with the guides and with your extra forms, and then you take them away and it doesn't look very good at all. Here's where you have to get really honest with yourself, because sometimes an idea, a design idea, seems like such a great idea that you just want to keep it, but it just doesn't work. And sometimes you may never even know precisely why. So you need to be really honest with yourself at this step. Is this a whole? And is it the best we can do? And ask your unconscious, ask your eyes. And they'll tell you. They may only tell you as a feeling, but they will tell you. And the repeat is necessary, because if the design problem is at all complicated, the probability of you getting it right the first time are pretty much nil. And if you know that from the start, then you don't worry so much about your first initial guess. You're just interested in getting something out there so you can see what it is. And you may have to go back and look at your constraints and even at your frame again to come up with a good solution. And even though we're going to talk about a really simplistic example, I haven't really talked that much about my work, but this is a project I did for a museum in Switzerland. And there were some pretty strong constraints. There were 5 artists involved. I was the one who actually did the composition and the layout for the installation. There was video. There was this notion that the works they were in a constellation. They weren't actually in some kind of set order, so the idea was to avoid having in a line or a grade against the wall. The walls were really irregular and quite high for showing work at this scale. Our budget was also quite small. Pictures against the wall, and there were multiple photographers. It was a space I also could not see until I got there, and I had 24 hours to install. So everything had to be done pretty precisely in advance, and this is where you see this kind of planning and this kind of composition really comes in handy. In fact, it's the difference between things working and disaster. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a really simplistic example so we can go through it just essentially in one step, because with YouTube we're not going to have time to do more than that. So here we go. We're going to work with Olama's example. It's a very simple one, but I think we can still illustrate the idea. And for ease, I've created forms to go over the top so that I can move and change them. And we're going to start off with just what would make sense, that since we're trying to show two different things and we want them to be equal so you can make a comparison between them, that we want to divide and decompose our piece in the middle. So I've started the process here, and now let's start to look at, hold on, here's the whole setup, but let's gradually start to move down, and you can see probably for this we don't need every single one of these nice little forms, but you can see they work really gradually, and as long as we're very careful. Okay, we're gradually moving these away until we are left. Now look at this. This is kind of telling me something. This might actually be an interesting place to stop, but we don't know. So we're gonna for the moment think about maybe closing this, and we're gonna look at something. We're gonna no, not that. We're gonna look at all these again, but now we're gonna think about maybe let's move them around. Start to think about how we could use them. Now it strikes me this is about the same size as Olama's form. I don't know if he did that naturally. Let's take our forms and put them to the side for the moment. We're going to look at this from a distance, because looking at things from a distance is often extremely helpful. And design actually is pretty close. We have this shape and this shape. These almost pretty much make our forms here if we decompose it. It's just a small overlap, slightly larger here, and just a slight bit here. So, but let's think about it. Could we maybe try something different? And where could we maybe get some ideas for what we could do differently from what we have? Now, looking at this, we can see that this is a pretty nice size, but unfortunately it's the wrong orientation. But we discovered before that orientation doesn't matter. We could have taken the squares apart differently. So what we're going to do is we're just going to turn this shape now so it takes up more of the space. And now that we have it turned, let's think about this for a moment. We could maybe put it in the same orientation that we had here. Okay, and then taking that shape, we're going to see what happens when we put that there. Now, we still need to think about our margins, so we can come up here and look at some of our forms and see something that might be, that looks like it might be a good margin. So if we move up this here, and finally get it to touch. Okay, with a little fiddling you can see that we could take and with all these little squares make space where every shape could be decomposed into parts that relate to our overall form in different quantities. So this gives us a little bit of idea, and we've got a rough cut here. But the thing is this is not our golden rectangle, so we need to compute that golden. It's not, and see what we get. We get almost 400, but let's go ahead and plug this number in. So then we clear everything away and take a look. And frankly, I kind of like Olama's design better. The important thing to remember is we could try this a lot of different ways. There's not one answer.